So are you ready to get started? Let's learn a bit about cutting your fabric. I don't know about you, but cutting fabric is intimidating to me because if you make a mistake, you pretty much have to scrap your piece. So in the quilt that I'm making, there's a real wide variety of pieces, but a lot of them are 2.5 by 4, for example, or 4.5, because ultimately it's going to be a 2 by 4 piece because you're going to have a 1/4 inch seam on each side, so that's the 1/2 inch of the portion of fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut a 2.5 by 4.5 square, rectangle. We talked about a cutting mat and the grid and how important that is. On this particular piece of fabric, I've taken it, and what I want to do is make sure that it's square to begin with, because if you're cutting and your piece of fabric isn't square, it's not going to do you any good to cut it because it will be off. So I've already done that line up, and if it didn't line up properly, I would cut it so that it would, so that I know that my edges beginning with are good. All right, so it really doesn't matter which way, because my pattern is not directional. It doesn't really matter which way I go here. But for me, I want to have the excess fabric on the left-hand side, and a lot of that is because I'm left-handed. So I'm going to start with cutting a piece that is 4 inches. And I'm going to brace my plexiglass piece like this. And in fact, tell you what, I'm going to turn it around so that I have my marking duct tape on this side so that I can more clearly see my starting point for my rotary blade. Now I'm bracing this with as much span as I can so that it's stable, straightening it over here. I'm using this side of the cutting blade. And what I'm going to do, you don't want to go back and forth with your blade. You want to start a little before the fabric, and you want to give it enough force that on a really sharp blade, it's going to do all the work for you. So you saw that was steady, and there you go. It's quite easy to get that fabric clean. All right, after you get the dimensions that you want, you're going to follow the fabric in piecing the pieces together. Now you're going to have 1/4 inch of a seam always, and you're going to press it to the darker fabric. So you're always going to have a seam that looks like this, pressed toward the darker side, and on this side you're going to have your pretty colors that start fitting together. Okay, let's move on. One of the things that I did to help stay square with the entire quilt, because you get lost kind of in one piece at a time, is to build a grid. Now to do this, you're going to need a wall or a floor that you can use. You're going to need a level that's long enough, wide enough to accommodate the width of your quilt and the length. And you're going to need a really good friend, because you can't do this by yourself. I have a step stool here too, because as I worked on my grid, it got higher and higher, and so it was much easier if I had all the tools at hand. So I put each square up as it was completed, and you kind of see some of my creative usage of duct tape at this point, and push pins. This is my test square, so it's a little worn right now. But what happens is that the quilt starts building itself, and it's really exciting to see each piece come together. In my particular case, a t-shirt quilt can go in any order because every square is the same dimension. And so in order to make a decision on how to put it together, I came up with the idea of taking a photograph of each one of the squares. Now these were loose, and I took them over to my girlfriend's house, who happened to have someone visiting, another female, and we went through a whole bunch of scenarios of how to put this quilt together. Finally, we came up with this one, and I then glued them on the paper, and I started stitching each one of the squares individually to the others in rows, this way and this way. That started forming the main body of the quilt. Wow, this is getting exciting because as the quilt gets done and the squares get put together, I'm going to give you a little bit of a view of how the one for my sister is turning out. Most of these t-shirts are ones that were my nephew's, and he wore them in various stages of his life, so she's really going to love it, I think. One of the t-shirts that didn't quite fit the pattern was one that I just could not give up, and so I've added it, but I had to do a little customization. And you know what, with a quilt, that's okay. You know, as I gained confidence in doing the quilt, it felt comfortable in just doing that, and I needed to preserve this personal piece of art that my nephew did. Now the pattern that I chose calls for actually 2 borders, and so I've got this vibrant yellow border and this beautiful blue border that I just love. So I've started already, you can see, but I need to put on the final yellow border, so I'm going to show you a little trick on how I get those to look pretty straight. And the other thing I'm going to do for you is give you a behind the seams, get it, seams, look at this quilt. Now this particular quilt, you can see that there is the interfacing on the backing of the pieces that we talked about before, and so that gives you a little bit of what the construction looks like. And believe me, it's a continuous task to keep all the little ravelings and threads, you know, picked up and taken care of. So remember, we talked about maybe having this thing handy. It really is handy. Now we're at the point where we're putting the borders on, and I've put 3 sides of the yellow border on, and I'm ready to do the 4th one. So to me, the border really helps kind of clean up any loose ends that you have literally on the sides of your quilt. So I'm going to show you how I do it so that it's pretty darn square and straight. I mentioned this steam a seam. Well, right now in putting together my last border on the quilt, I want to show you exactly how I use that. Now, this is a 1/2 inch piece of the material, and it's really sticky on one side and not so sticky on the other side. Well, I cut it into thirds to use it for what I need to use it for. So it ends up that I have these little strips like this. Now the border, I take the border that I've prepared and I put it down right side on the ironing board, and then I kind of look at the line that's already in the ironing board cover to kind of give it a line up to that line. Then I take a strip of this material, this steam a seam, and I put the stickiest side down, and I just smooth it out a little bit and secure it. Okay, it's ready to go. Except I'm going to go ahead and complete this entire length of the ironing board. Now the other thing that I really like about this stuff is that you can just do it to the length that you need, and then you just break it off real easily. All right, perfect, perfect, looking good. So now I take the right side of the edge of the quilt that I'm going to be putting on the border. You always want right sides together when you're going to sew. Well, this is, by the way, I could pin this, but I think I'm straight pin challenged. It never seems to work out very well for me. And so I found that this has been really effective. Okay, we already have our border lined up. We have our steam seam lined up. And so now all we have to do is get everything else lined up down the line, and we're ready to iron. Make sure it's in alignment like that, and basically I hold it on there for 5 seconds. Now what that does is give me a bond. Now I guess it could be permanent, however I'm going to stitch it, of course, and this will add additional stability, and for stitching it's a dream because I don't have to continually take out straight pins, so it works awesome.